No, it's actually probably more like 30 seconds or so, but I appreciate the attentiveness for everyone. Thank you very much. Does anyone recognize the picture? You saw it last night, actually. Not the same angle. Yeah, so if you noticed last night when he showed the picture of the Wailing Wall, there's a room to the bottom left. This is the men's side, so the women can't go in this room. The room is filled with books. I have another picture, which is not in the deck, of the book, the shelves and shelves of commentary on the Torah, and basically, but there's a lot more books for that than the books that were written, obviously, for it. But this is going out towards the Wailing Wall from that room, because I was curious what was in that room. I had an opportunity just to take a tour, I was mentioned yesterday, and it was really quite interesting to see the sites that you hear so much about, and probably in areas where Christ would have walked is still something that reminds me of things. So yesterday we went over kind of just the foundations of the congregation, God's called out ones, us, the body of Christ, the people, which has always been the core of salvation, obviously the core of everything that the scriptures are about. It's about us, and we've been blessed to be part of it. We pray that we'll continue to be part of it. So now we're going to talk about the early church, the early Ecclesia, and the Ecclesia in the wilderness, and talk about how it transitioned into the kingdom of Israel, which was God's Ecclesia, right? The called out ones from the beginning. So we're going to go through first, look at some of the Old Testament precedents, talk about that Ecclesia in the wilderness, the time of Judges, time of Kings. All the things are consistent through all this time, and should be for us as well, is who's the head. God should always be the head. That's always what we are looking to follow, is the scriptures which God has set up for us, and that's what the children of Israel were always supposed to do as well, starting from the very beginning. And of course their center point was the congregation was centered around the temple. Now the temple, we don't have a temple today, but we still can look towards the temple, so to speak, in a figurative sense. So I'm going to start with and look at this, what we call blueprint of the Ecclesia itself. There's a theological foundation, structural and mission precedents, and then kind of the evolution into what we would say today is the congregations and how we do church. So I will say that sometimes. How do we actually execute the memorial service or Bible classes? I'll probably more focus on the memorial service as we get to those later in the week. But you have the called out ones from the beginning, right? Abraham was called out, and goes to his promise, and the promises start from there. Of course, then they go down to Egypt. I forget which brother talked about going into the pit. Is that your exhortation, Brother Paul? It was about going into the pit. And I also think about going down to Egypt and coming out of Egypt, right? So it's always coming out of sin or out of the quagmire and so on. So they're called out again out of Egypt. And then there's, both the Abrahamic covenant and then that of Moses, right, and the children of Israel. And there was a pre-configurement at Mount Sinai. And we're going to do some comparisons between the Ecclesia that was defined there and was given the blessing, the Ten Commandments, and then what will that look like in the kingdom age. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Obviously, there was a dwelling place that God set up and had them set up so they could, even though he wasn't physical. Physical is not something we probably can understand from a God perspective, but a place where he dwelled. So we'll just put there. It was a physical place where he dwelled, and his power was there. And it was probably something that was definitely needed. We could probably argue it's still needed, but hopefully he dwells in us, and we look to dwell with him and his son. And then so there's a model of leadership that gets developed, of course, with Aaron and his family, but then later in the lay ministers and others, or lay clergy, so to speak, and elders, Sanhedrin and others that were formed over time, and then set up through the commission of the Great Commission that we have through Jesus, and which is looking for redemption, looking for salvation through the learning and understanding the scriptures, following the things that we are to emulate, And the Ecclesia continues to be an important component. Our congregations become a component of that to help one another and to profess internally, as I said yesterday, and externally. So let's look at a little bit about the Ecclesia, because a lot of churches now, when I say church like that, it means general Christianity would say, the church is God-given. The structure is, or the people are, but obviously the building isn't, but churches aren't necessarily God-given at all, because what they believe may be way off from what is actually in Scripture. But the foundation of what the church is today, or the Ecclesia congregation called out, starts at the very beginning in Scriptures. And for those communities that don't pay attention to the Old Testament or don't even look at it, they're missing some really fundamental foundational elements. And it's hard to build a building without a foundation. And if you don't have a foundation, then a lot of the New Testament doesn't make as much sense. So why are some of the edicts and other things that take place over the hundreds of thousands of years, it's filling gaps, because they don't really understand the full continuous discussion and setup from the Garden of Eden all the way through Christ and today, and will come true in the kingdom age to come. So the Assembly of Israel definitely served as a pre-configurement, so a type of what will become later Israel was the kingdom on earth in physical, and will become the kingdom on earth again. And so we established through those covenants, the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant to Moses and people on Mount Sinai, was that foundations of setting up, and then we know through Christ we are bonded or into that body of Christ and brought in like you would. Has anyone ever done the splicing of a branch of one fruit tree to another fruit tree? Yeah, so that is such a great thing. I know my great-grandfather did that, and he had a tree that I think was like 3 or 4 different fruits in the backyard in Brooklyn, New York. And it's a way of, you can say, okay, how can you do that? Well, you can do that, actually. And that's how we're spliced into the children of Israel. So we have the covenant. Covenant is very important to foundate, is the foundation for the called out group. So we're called out through those covenants, right, and through the promises through Isaac and Jacob and so on, through David and so on, through Christ, etc. That's an important component of being called out, is that we have that lineage, that line of understanding from the beginning. And then we have let's take a look at Genesis here for a second, just to remind everyone. So what does God say here? It says, I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee. And this is, as I said, I think is King James, right? So someone can probably say yes. What my default setting is. Make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And he shall all families of earth be blessed. It's still true. God's people have not been forsaken. They've forsaken at times God, as we have as well, I'm sure. Even as individuals at times, we forget about God. But we can always come back as we have God's blessing to do so, and forgiveness, obviously. And then the one to Moses at Mount Sinai was a very significant point in time. This is now a very large congregation. Only a small group, family, left and went down to Egypt for hundreds of years and came back as a nation, which unfortunately wandered for 40 years before they got back to the land. But they were set up as a king of priests and a holy nation from Exodus 19:6. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. So we talked yesterday about synagogues and how synagogues played an important role to keep the Jewish society or Hebrew alive throughout history. They've never lost their identity, even though they lost their nation for a long time, as they left in AD 70 and didn't come back until early in the 1948, became a nation in 1948, but they kept their heritage through that whole time. They were not blended into the world, at least not in the large sense, but maybe in certain pockets they were. So the Sinai covenant, so the gathering of Israelites there marked a major significant era in their period. It bound them to God through the Ten Commandments. So specifically the day that thou shouldst stand before the Lord thy God in Hebron, when the Lord said unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my word, and that they may learn to fear me all the days that thou shalt live upon the earth, and they may teach their children. Now, I look at this, and some of the discussions have already taken place, fear. I always looked at fear in this state as respect, honor. Now, God is very powerful, all-powerful. God can do anything he wants, certainly, but I respect him. I hope I don't fear. I don't do things out of fear. I should do things, we should do things out of love, not out of fear. But we definitely should have respect. So this event here on the, you can think about. I always think about the Ten Commandments, the movie, of course, with Charlton Heston, which does there's some license there certainly, but it's reasonably accurate, I would say, from Scripture. But it's pretty powerful. Cecil B. DeMille and the color and everything was pretty powerful. But again, it's pretty good. I always like the verse, last night that came up about, I put gold in and this calf came out. Right. It just happened to happen. Now, Aaron got somewhat punished, but Aaron didn't die from that, actually. It was kind of interesting. But this covenant is very, very critical. So what is God's promises, right? Abrahamic covenant, the Old Testament, God promises that there would be this continuation. God does not go back on his promises. We're very fortunate of that, of course. Promises point towards the larger blessing, as we know, the fulfillment yet to come, but that his family would always be there, and he'd always look to his family. So there's definitely a model for learning. Old Testament's a foundation, and we need to remember that as we build our understanding in Scriptures as well, that we can't look past that. So, as I said, the foundation for the Ecclesia, or the way that we work, the way we do church, what we believe, these foundational elements of the covenants that take place from the very beginning throughout time are very critical. We don't really, I would say it's hard to understand Christ's redemption, his power, without understanding the Old Testament, because he was preached throughout it and fulfillment. Unfortunately, many people have been blinded to that, even the Jews at his time, many were blinded to that as well. So called out. Or summoned, maybe another way of looking at it. So God does the calling, or through us, he does the calling. Some people listen to it, some people don't. It's still up to us. And I think it was Brother Gordon that said, we could have been all made robots. What purpose does that serve? Does that, really serve God? We have to do that. So classical Greek and Old Testament usage, it refers to an assembly of people, as we've discussed already, called out. So I think there's two sides of it. One is, we have been fortunate to be called, but we also have responsibilities because we have been called. And that's responsibility to ourselves to do what God has asked us to do, or try our best, but also I think, again, to shine brightly to those that haven't been blessed, and be a calling card for others. So this redemption is really important. It's part of the Ecclesia. It's part of the congregation. It's part of our responsibility to help people to redeem people to God. So the promises, the prophecies found in the Old Testament point towards Jesus, right? As I've been saying, the Ecclesia continues the mission of redemption and restoration. And so it plays a role. It's not something that happened and is not needed anymore, right? We need to remember, and said this yesterday, think about the memorial service as an example. There's nothing special about it. But what does it do for a human? It reminds us of something. What do reading the Scriptures do? It reminds us of something. And garbage in, garbage out. It's kind of like first in, first out that was mentioned. But if we fill ourselves with good stuff, most likely the first thing we're going to think about is good. If we fill our stuff with bad stuff or forget about the good stuff, then we'll pay the penalty for that, of course. But this is the human nature that we have, and God knows our human nature. He created us. So these are all important structures to help us along the path, and when we fall, that we can pick each other up. So spiritual dwelling for God, right, in the Old Testament, where we had the tabernacle, the temple then was created, and there was multiple temples, as we know. Leadership and authority was provided. There's the governance that was provided, the elders, the priests, and other structures that were maintained, or at times maintained, and other times not so maintained, but to keep people focused on God. And of course, there's the times where the temple was closed, and later they find the scrolls, and the different stories that take place of refining the truth over the time. And I wish you look back at it and go, how could they forget it so fast? Well, it's not fast. Sometimes it's hundreds of years. Over time, you slip away. And of course, our community's only been around for 150, 170 years or so. And there's been other communities, and there's others even out there that we probably don't know as much about. But there's other communities that have long since gone. There's a whole community in southern France, a Protestant community. I forget the name of it now, but one of my colleagues in France was telling me about it. What was that? Someone?
The
No, it's further south than that. I'll have to look it up, and I'll if I remember, I'll tell you tomorrow, or I'll say what it was. But they were persecuted heavily by the Catholic Church, and just really heavily. And so my colleague who grew up Protestant in France, which is very unusual. He doesn't really practice. He came to the States. He says, "I'm going to come early. I want to go to church with you." So he was happy to do that, and he was excited that we were so open to him. It's like, no, this is what we should be doing. So this comparison here. So we have Mount Sinai, kind of the earthly covenant, the earthly kingdom that was being set up there. It wasn't, there was already discussions, and we know there's descriptions about it being fearful, terrible, people shaking about it. I mean, it was awesome. Maybe, just imagine this mountain that's covered and the sounds and the lightning and everything. I understand fear. I mean, if you can see something like that, and then Moses comes down sometime later with these tablets, then he throws them down, and then that opens up and swallows a bunch of people. I mean, this is a powerful situation that would have taken place. And you can see some comparisons here. You have, to the gospel ecclesia, where you're moving from, the earthly congregation to now a scriptural, ultimately holy organization, or heavenly organization. Now, heavenly from a God's point of view, not heavenly as in heaven. So we have a more milder, a spiritual state. We've moved from, hopefully, not so always, but moving from the law to mercy, right? From lists of do this and don't do this to working and putting on, as Brother Jim has been talking about, eternal life, the way of living, the eternal way of living, where then the kingdom age, or in Mount Zion, the universal access to mediation, the message of mercy, these are all core things. So we have, on the left, Moses, a very good man, had his issues, as we all do, but still God's chosen to Christ, which perfect, his son. We have the atmosphere dark and stormy and dreadful to one that is filled with light. Think about how the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven is described, for example, in different stones, and really welcoming. And then, of course, the earthly based in Mount Sinai, or started in Mount Zion. So in the wilderness, we know the verse, I think I read it the other day, but I'll read just a little bit more for the context here in Acts 7:36. He brought them out. After that, he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses, which said unto the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you and your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness, with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us. So, a very powerful statement. Now, I talked to Dottie yesterday. And again, she's not here because she couldn't get off of work, and she confirmed that she couldn't get off of work. Those are writing the cards. Thank you for writing. I saw there's a card to her. She greatly appreciate that. She's probably listening right now, so she's probably mad at me that I'm saying this, but she sends her regards. But she told me I had to go a little slower, so I said I'll bring some soda, some Coke, and I'll take a sip every once in a while. That requires me to pause a little bit. All right, so, and again, Christ's Ecclesia, we'll just say the Ecclesia of the New Testament is a continuation of this. I think we all understand that quite well. A couple of things. I tend to look at Matthew Henry's commentary at times, because I find, for the most part, it's pretty reasonable. There are some things that definitely, from his background and his belief structure, is different than we would say ours is. And rightly so, I would say different. But for the most part, he has some really good insight of things. So he talks about the camp of Israel, called the Ecclesia in the wilderness. It was a sacred society. It was incorporated by a divine character under the divine government, blessed with divine relation. The Ecclesia in the wilderness was an Ecclesia, though it was not yet perfectly formed. It was to be when they came to Canaan, but every man did what it was right in his own eyes. It was the honor of Moses that he was in the Ecclesia, and many a time it would have been destroyed if Moses had not been in it to intercede for it. But Christ is the president and guide of a more excellent and glorious Ecclesia than that in the wilderness was, and is more in it as a life and soul of it than Moses could be. I think it's a really nice summary of describing that. And I didn't quote this exactly because I do change some of his Old English. It's not Old English. Now I understand but it's not contemporary English either, as you can tell. So let's take a look at Hebrews 18 through 24 here. For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched and burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest, and a sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, which voice they heard entreated that the word should not be spoken to them anymore, for they could not endure that which was commanded. And if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned and thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than of Abel. Really great summary. So Paul talks about the gospel ecclesia. That may be a better way to say than Christ ecclesia, but it is Christ ecclesia. It's not ours. As opposed to the Jewish ecclesia or synagogue structure, temple structure in his time. There are some interesting descriptions as well, which Paul provides, talking about the external versus the earthly, and what was formed and ended up being formed, or what was formed in Mount Sinai, whereas the state of the gospel ecclesia is to be formed in Mount Zion. So yesterday I asked Brother Kurt about the picture of Jerusalem, in which you see the Temple Mount. By the way, in that picture you also could see, it's a little harder to see because it was far away, but the Golden Gate is sealed up there. And then you see the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is just to the left of it, which was in the picture as well. But you're standing on Mount Zion, Mount of Olives, to look down on it. So I asked him, where you're standing or what you're looking at. So right. I'm sorry to be particular there, but it's wonderful place. I think I'll have a picture of it maybe later because I want to point something else out, which I won't say now. So some other things, Matthew Henry, again, dark dispensation. You think of what Paul's describing here in Hebrews, it sounds, I say awful, it's probably the wrong way of saying, but powerful. Or again, it should have been awesome. And they should have been fear of, we were saved. We just passed through the waters dry. You know, the great chariots of Egypt were destroyed. It took out thousands and thousands of people. Yet we're already complaining. And again, we probably do the same thing. I mean, we look at it and go, wow, we wouldn't do that. We probably would. Because, you know, all of a sudden we're remembering the garlic and the leeks and everything else. And even though we probably didn't have much of that because we're all slaves. But you just think about it. It's sad, but again, we're human and we probably see the same thing as well. So you think about the difference about that powerful moment to what we're described in the New Testament of what will come, you know, a more clear, brighter, welcoming. Not that God wasn't welcoming. I mean, he always welcomed a stranger even, but it was for a different purpose, I guess you could say. The ecclesia was getting set up, or the congregation, the children of Israel were getting set up. They needed to know who was in control, right? And you know, hopefully we have the message, and we've received the message over and over again. So in the wilderness, it was dreadful, terrible dispensation. This is what Paul talks about, you know, the thunder and the lightning and so on. And the gospel ecclesia needs to get to the next level, right? It has to be mild, kind, more approachable. And actually, Brother Gord was kind of talking about that. How do we become approachable? Question?
Well, I was going to say, we kind of have to be a little bit tempered when we're talking about the children of Israel. Remember, they were 400 years inundated with all these
yes.
gods. And so I think they were somewhat fearful of the presence of God because that was kind of new to them. So.
I agree. I would hope so. And I think, as I said, I think that's why God had to do it that way. He had to show them who he was. I think, you know, it's clear that they knew that they were Israeli or Hebrews. So I think that was clear. Obviously, that was kept during those 400 years. But they probably had slipped away, as we would have as well, over 400 years. That's a long period of time. But slipped away of really understanding the power of God. Now again, he shows the miracles. That's what Paul says. I see, he show these things in the covenant. He provides food for them and manna for them and those other things. These are all these miracles. But again, as I said, we would do the same thing probably. That was well said. Thank you. Some other things from Matthew Henry is a limited dispensation. Under the gospel, we'll have full access to God through Christ, His Son. It was a dangerous dispensation. The fire burning on the mountain and so on. You would die if you touched the mountain. We know all that is true. But sin is dangerous, right? This is really kind of, again, representing they were coming out of Egypt, right, out of sin. They were going to be given the promised land where they were to follow God and be given the ability to follow God in a very open way. So they were making this transition, and this was the start of their journey to go do that. But that was the state of the early Jewish ecclesia. It was being formed, and it was coming out of Egypt, out of sin, and it was going into the new land. So they were the chosen family, and as I said, they are still the chosen family. And we see, I talk to a lot of Christians, and they're like, God left the Jews. It's like, no. It clearly, if he leaves the Jews, why would he not leave us, sinners, right? So it's a really important point. And of course, Scripture is very clear about it. But they were stubborn, as we are at times, hard-hearted, as we are at times. We're no different in that we have the blessing and we have the opportunity, but we're still human, just like they were. So a little bit more about, in verse 22 of the passage I just read, this heavenly Jerusalem, which is free, opposition to, and opposite of what Mount Sinai was all about. And so this is a progression as well. That's the other thing to think about is the thousands of years that have already taken place, and who knows how much more, that the evolution, and not revolution, but the evolution, we change over time. We have to transform. Right? The Scriptures are very clear about this. We've heard some of these things today, in the last couple of days, and our other brethren are speaking as well. But life is about transformation. It's about putting on the new man, right? Putting on the Spirit, the Spirit gifts, and taking that on, and doing the best that we can to do that. And again, the ecclesial family has to do the same thing. Because if we're part of the ecclesial family has to evolve as well. And we'll get more of this on Thursday about the difference between practice and principles, but some of that's already been discussed as well. And it's the principles that we have to stick to. That's what will allow us to transform. So you can see in verse 22, it talks about an innumerable company of angels, same family with the saints, on the same head. Those that by faith are joined to the gospel, ecclesia are joined to the angels. That's another important thing to think about. We know Christ walks amongst us. It's very clear in Scripture. And I think we probably all feel that there are angels out there. And some of us, by the way, I believe coincidences are God-given opportunities. And I've had too many things that have happened to me in life to saying, well, I'm glad I have that opportunity. And I thank God for that opportunity. And God does work with us, again, if we let Him. Right. So Paul describes here at General Assembly, the saints of all times, so are the promises, children, are the heirs, anyone who has the privilege of the firstborn, obviously, as we know. And to God, the judgment of all, that's verse 23, that God will judge both Jew and Gentile. So, as believers, how do we come to God? We come to God through faith, and it's talked about, the grace that we have, the opportunity to go do this. We'll not earn it, as in, okay, we have these many pluses, this many minuses. We'll either be in the book or not, but we're in the book. If we're written in the book, we're not blotted out. It's because we've been given grace. There's mercy, and we have enough faith, whatever we can do as individuals. But the stronger we are as together, obviously, the stronger the individuals will be as well. So, verse 23, the Spirit of men made perfect to the best of men, the righteous who were found in the right character. That's what we're looking for, to be perfect through the trials of faith. And finally, Jesus, the mediator, this is verse 24, the blood sprinkling that speaketh things that of Abel. There's no better encouragement, in my belief, than to devote ourselves to the gospel. This gives us the guide that we need. And I've never felt in my life, and I pray that none of you feel this way, that we've ever been cheated of anything. If anything, we should feel, and I think I do feel, blessed. Is life simple? No. Is it easy at times? No. But are we blessed always? Yes. We have that opportunity anyway. So the gospel and new covenant, distinct covenant, from works, which was more of a focus in the Old Testament, now under a new dispensation, and Christ is the mediator of the new covenant. He's the person that brings us closer to God, that through him and through what he showed that what could be done. So new covenant ratified through his blood, through his sacrifice, through his free sacrifice. It's really important, and I always like the symbol, when the earthquake happened, that the veil split to the most holy place. He opened that up, and before it was only the high priest was able to go in there, was it once a year, and it's a really powerful metaphor there. By the way, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, supposedly they have the spot where that's split, but yeah, I don't believe that. It's like the guy touring, he says, yeah, that's what they think it is, but who knows? They also think it's on Golgotha. The same church is on Golgotha too. So, all right. So it's the sinners in the name of God. It speaks pardon to their sins, peace to their beings, and obedience, the highest love and thankfulness. And that's what we have blessed through the to the Ecclesia, to that structure that we have. All right. So some governance. So we get into now the era of judges, and then we'll talk a little bit about the kings. But you have the Torah, which lays down the law, right? The books of the law. Very, very clear. If you're going to bring a community together, you need to have some rules. Right? That's human nature. God understands that, and he has that put down. Moses puts that down, and it becomes core to their belief structure and has been ever since. And it's core, I think, to our belief structure as well. And the temple becomes, the tabernacle itself becomes a center of worship, and then the setup of the priests, the prophets, and the judges, ultimately, charismatic judges at times. But you have this cycle, and this was mentioned the other day by a brother, the cycle that Israel went through before the kings, well, even during the kings, but you had disobedience and to the divine command, then you have anarchy for a period of time, and then there's a redeemer that comes over and over again. Again, over large periods of times, of course. So this period of anarchy, God instructs very clearly on the way out of, or in the wilderness, I should say, that when you go into the land, what should you do? Right? You should destroy everyone that's living there. You should make no covenants with them. You should, break down all the images and all the altars and not marry any of them. Now, which one of those were followed to the T? None of them. Again, we probably wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do it either. That's what we should strive to do. But again, it does happen. But it caused issues, and the issues they paid for over and over again, as we can pay for our own, not following God's instructions. So, and it's really important. Let's look at Judges here, 2 and 1, starting on verse 1. And an angel of the Lord came up upon Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers, and said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. You shall throw down their altars, and so on. So it was very clear, and I'm sure they knew it if they read it, and they, many of them would have read it. Certainly the prophets knew what it was. But they ended up going over time, doing what was right in their own eyes, as we know of in Judges 17 and verse 6. So we have many examples of those that saved them at times, like Samson and Gideon, and temporarily they would come back. They would be reminded, and it happened that to us as well. Sometimes we need to be shaken, so to speak. I talk about this even at work, that sometimes we have to come to Jesus meetings, right? You got to put everything on the table. You have to be truthful, honest, transparent. Say, this is how it is. Either we get on a better path, or we're going to continue to do the dumb things that we've done for a long time, and that can be problematic. So 1 Samuel 3 and 1, and the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. We don't get contacted directly. Well, I think through prayer, you probably, or through circumstances, we get contacted, but we don't have a verbal contact anyway. But we are spoken to all the time by one another, by the scriptures, through prayer, and so on. So in Israel and through the judges, right, they set up a church, God-based, right, a theocratic system, and that God was to be the king, right? We're very familiar with that. And that was to be the head of the Ecclesia, right? Israel is the Ecclesia. It is the congregation. It is the called out one. And you had this federation of tribes and elders and others that would force up, but they were all to look to God and to his commandments, to follow them. Individuals and the community as a whole was to follow God's laws and the laws of Moses that were handed down. Pretty straightforward, but hard to do, again, especially when you're looking around. Oh, well, so-and-so is doing this. Oh, they have a king, and we know the whole story. We can do the same thing. Oh, these other churches are doing this, that, and the other thing. Is it practice or is it principle? If it's a principle, got to question it. If it's a practice, well, maybe there's something else we could adopt. And again, I'm going to get more into that later in the week. So then we get this system. We had the priests and the Levites that were part of it, and they were important. They played a very important role, a religious role and a judicial role as well. There's the Torah, right, the beginning of the Bible, and that laid out the legal and ethical code that they were to follow. And then the prophets. The prophets were basically influencers and also kept people honest, so to speak, especially the kings when they ended up being kings there. But they were guides that did get messages from God, and they brought those to the people. So there's some key aspects. The judges were often charismatic as well. They were religious, sometimes military leaders. You see this throughout the books of Judges. They were decentralized, spread out throughout the organization. They were not a monarchy. They weren't just someone at the top of a pyramid, so to speak. Tabernacle, though, still played a very important role. It wasn't, of course, in Jerusalem yet, but it played an important role where it was, because that was still God's seat. So God still dwelled among them, not just spiritually, but physically, you could argue. At least that was what it was supposed to be perceived as. And so religious life still should have been a focus of their attention through this period of time. So then you move into the kings. And you still have the prophets, you still have the priests, but they were given a king, right? God was, I'm sure, very disappointed. We kind of see that in scriptures, that they wanted a king. They wanted to be like everyone else, but the king still was responsible to God. And there was a check and balances between the priests, the prophets, and the king. Some kings wanted to be total, dictators, so to speak. Others were much more prayerful, and when they prayed and when they sought God, they were blessed. And those that weren't were usually not there very long, or they had a horrible death. God's retribution was fulfilled as needed. There was still the covenant. They were still under the covenant. But you had kind of the rise of rabbis as well, especially after AD 70. The rabbis became a much more important role. You don't have the priests anymore. It seems like every Jew that I've met, they always say they're related to the Kohites or the Levites, but it really shifted away, obviously, especially when the temple went away. The need for the priests went away as well. So a little bit as we start wrapping up here, as the monarchy rose, right, you're still directed or to be directed by God, scriptures, and the prophets. The king's authority, this is a really important point. Again, this is now map this to the ecclesias today. So Brother Gord said, a recording brother, a recording secretary. This is not an authoritative person. This is someone that coordinates things. Someone serves the ecclesia, right? The king was to serve his people, God's people, and to answer to God. It was not to be like the other kings. But again, some fell into that trap very quickly. So in the period of this, again, religious governmental structure was a complex system. 3 branches, again, king, prophets, and priests. The king held the political power, so that's kind of where the interaction with other nations took place, as we know. But Israel was still a theocracy. It was meant to be God was the true king even then. But there was some checks and balances, and quite often it was the prophet that would come and tell the king, you're being foolish, right? You've missed the whole point. You forgot about the law. You should go look at these scrolls, and so on. So the kings were appointed, at least early on, definitely by God. We know that. And sometime, God gave in. And I always think it's interesting, when Saul is identified, God did the identification, but he knew what he was identifying, someone that looked like a king. Maybe, and I'm sure he knew Saul's heart. At the time, Saul was a good person, but he had his faults. But then he picked someone that's totally opposite, maybe in this young shepherd boy, but he also knew his heart as well. So those were both were good selections for a purpose. And then later they divided and had all those other issues at times. So as a head of state, unlike, as it says here, near Eastern monarchs, power was not absolute. At least that was the intent, that again, he was to serve God as well. And again, some did better than others. The prophets there to basically keep things aligned, role was to hold the king and the ruling elite accountable to God's law. Prophets such as Samuel could anoint the king, indicating their role in legitimizing the rule. So they played an important role. And I would say prophets play an important role today through Scripture, because they can point out things. There's nothing new under the sun. I mean, anything we encounter as humans has happened before. Probably happened even in the last, in our generation, let alone that are written in Scriptures. So king, prophets, and priests, they all answered to God, as we all should do as well. One of the things when we founded the Ann Arbor Ecclesia back in '97, I think it was, we decided not to say recording. What was it? ABs, arranging board. We decided to say serving brethren, and it was just simple. I mean, I know that is kind of somewhat code and jargon, but we did that because we wanted to indicate that we were serving the Ecclesia, and I think we've taken that to heart for the most part. But that's the real issue there. And we also did term limits too, so no one could feel that they owned a certain role. And we still do that today. And we still call it serving brethren. So you get the priests, right, descendants of Aaron, we know that. They had rituals and other things that they were to do in the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, and then Herod's temple later. Priests were significant influencers over legal and administrative matters as well. They held a unique position, right, the chief religious leader, mediating between God and the people, right, through the sacrifices and so on. And as I said, they're the only ones that are allowed to enter the temple's Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, and that was true until Christ died and the veil was split and open to all. So while the monarchy definitely established centralized government, it didn't do what God needed it to, or what the people really needed, which was a leader who led them or kept them on God's path. And part of the problem is the leaders themselves have to be kept on God's path. And this is where we can fall down within an ecclesial family as well, where we forget that our number one purpose is to help each other, right? And the ecclesia is God provided. It's never our ecclesia, it's our building or our truth, right? It's God's. And that's one of the biggest issues that we can see over times, where we get comfortable as individuals in the way it is. We should never be comfortable the way it is, because it's never that good. It can always be better, right? And I'm not saying it's terrible, but it can always be better. So we have to focus on that as well. So there's a repeated failure fueled centralized tension in the monarchy over time, and we have this, again, going from a good king to a bad king to a good king to a bad king to a worse king, and just going back, again, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So we know in AD 70, Rome decided they gave up with the Jews and said, we're done. We're sick and tired basically of your revolts that you have. And they were God finally had them scattered. The rest of basically Judah and Israel, Israel had been scattered a long time before that, and the rest of Judah basically was scattered at this point. And so the authority of the temple went away, and their homeland went away. But Ezekiel and others, of course, predicted that this would happen and that there would be a regathering at some point. So a couple of final comments here. So we have this foundation in the wilderness, right? God had already made identified Abraham, called him out to go to the promised land. And then obviously later, as we know, the family went down to Egypt because of the famine. And luckily, they had some family down there already. And they were 400 years later, came out of Egypt, but as a family, as a large family, as the congregation. And they were called out there as well, brought out. Remember, Moses was like, I'm not going to do this. And he's like, no, you need to do this. I will help you do this. And Aaron was there as well to help him. But this is a major setup of the ecclesia as we know it today. And this is where the Jews and the Hebrews came from. So it was formed there, and it was really showing God's power that he first could bring them out of Egypt. Right? He didn't take them physically and just plop them somewhere else, which he probably could do. They had to go do that work. But he showed them the way. I mean, just thinking about the pillar of fire at night, that would have been pretty awesome too to see. And again, it led them to get into the land, unfortunately 40 years later. But then he set up and had them set up something that was based on him, which over time they, at times abused, at times forgot about, and other times it was really good. And it goes back to those that bless Israel are blessed. Those that bless God and follow God will be better off than those that don't. Plain and simple. It doesn't mean someone else that doesn't believe in God won't have a good life, but it's a temporary, very short life. You think about if we are truly blessed with immortality, we can't even fathom. I think, Brother Jim, you mentioned about, it's nothing said about what goes on later. I don't think we could understand it or appreciate it probably. So it's just thinking about living in immortality, what that could mean. But this checks and balances, which we have to have in our ecclesias as well. We have to have those that are ministering, right? They have different jobs and different responsibilities. That's an important role of a body, that you have different things that are done and have to be taken care of. Again, we're not all good at everything, so we should do what we can best do and how we can best support it. But we're looking to the day where we evolve, the ecclesias evolve into something that is blessed and ultimately in the kingdom age. So we have the what we say the gospel ecclesia, in the new covenant through Christ, where we move from legalism, which is still a problem amongst us at times, to mercy, to forgiveness, and that we shift away from even the legalism that the Jews have. And I said at the beginning that fairly large room on the side there of the Wailing Wall is filled with legalistic books that interpret the scriptures over and over and over again. And we need to move away from that as well. And luckily, again, our communities are pretty good about that. Yes, we have some really good books way over there, but they're not meant to replace the scriptures. I think none of the books that we publish in the community. By the way, I'm on the Tidings Committee, so if anyone interested about talking about the Tidings, you can talk to me. But I know the Tidings of Christadelphia and others never sought to go publish something to replace scriptures by any means. It's to hopefully help us study scriptures, and that's always the intent. So with that, again, I'll end today with just telling you what's on for tomorrow, which is we're going to move on to Christ and the first century ecclesias, and we'll get to see what are the points we can learn at that and we'll go from there, and hopefully we'll continue through this. I'm really looking forward to as we build out on this, kind of and hopefully you're getting some practical advice and discussions as we go through this. But we're going to talk about some more difficult topics about where we're at today when we get to Thursday. With that, thank you very much. So we have about 29 minutes till Brother Jim will start. Thanks.
Thank you, Brother Peter.